The contact clock read 5 hours, 51 minutes when the veteran high priest paused mid-verse and looked at his own hands. I was watching him on feed 3, the secondary diplomatic camera, positioned to cover the delegation's dais rather than the main negotiating table. And I noticed because I had been watching him for most of those 5 hours and 51 minutes, which is what a junior signals officer does when she has no signals to manage. The veteran delegation had gone radio silent the moment their shuttle docked. They communicated internally by something that registered on my board as a faint standing vibration in the 40 Hz band, nothing my equipment was designed to intercept, and the protocols made clear I wasn't supposed to try. So I watched. I logged. I kept my console clean and waited for the ceremony to end so I could eat something. His name, the priest's name, insofar as any of us knew it, was rendered in the official briefing as Orthavith the Third Recital. I had read that twice before the docking, and still had no clear sense of what Third Recital meant in veteran hierarchy. The briefing said he was the second highest ranking member of the Sovereignty's Doctrinal Surveying Council, which was the body responsible for classifying newly encountered species according to the Sovereignty's sacred taxonomy. It said that his presence represented a significant elevation of the contact tier from the previous 2 veteran visits. It said, in careful diplomatic language, that we should consider the ceremony an honor. He was tall. That was the first thing I had registered when the delegation stepped off the shuttle, tall, thin-limbed, with the forward-angled posture that veteran biology apparently imposed on all mature adults, a consequence of the heavy neck ridge that supported their sensory array. The ridge ran from the crown of the skull back along the spine, bony and visible through the ceremonial robes, and it gave the high priest the look of a man perpetually leaning into wind. His 2 attendants had the same ridge, the same lean, but they were shorter and kept half a step behind. They had not spoken since boarding. None of the delegation had spoken in a language my equipment could parse, and that was by design. Veteran ceremonial law prohibited direct address to third-tier species during an official survey. Everything passed through their appointed intermediary, a small, pale functionary named Sess, who had been assigned to Tyrant diplomatic contacts for 11 years, and who had the particular exhausted patience of a professional translator, who has spent a decade explaining the same cultural gap from both sides. Sess was standing at the table when I came on shift and was still standing there now. He had not sat down once in 5 hours and 51 minutes. I had offered him a chair early in the first hour, and he had declined with a polite, practiced nod that told me he had declined the same offer many times before. I think standing was easier for him than explaining why veteran protocol prohibited ceremonial survey participants from occupying seats lower than the primary survey subject. The primary survey subject was the Tyrant's lance. Or more precisely, the Tyrant's lance was the ship the veteran sovereignty had formally requested permission to inspect as part of their diplomatic survey of Terran outpost capacity in the veteran-adjacent border zones. The request had come through the standard channels 8 months ago. The response had taken 4 months, which I'd heard was considered breakneck speed for anything involving the Sovereignty's Doctrinal Council. The survey was supposed to confirm what 2 previous veteran contact missions had already noted in their official records, that humanity maintained a modest diplomatic presence in this sector, with light-class vessels, minimal armament, and the tentative infrastructure of a species still finding its way to the galactic table. The Tyrant's lance was a diplomatic frigate, 48 crew, 3 medium-range signal arrays, one of which was mine, a complement of point defense systems that could be politely described as defensive, a command staff of 8, including Commander Vel Akaffer, who had run diplomatic-class ships for 19 years and who, when I had reported for duty 6 weeks ago, had shaken my hand and said, "You'll be bored for most of it, and the rest of it you'll never forget." I had assumed he meant the stars. The ceremony was called the Rite of Categorical Reckoning. Sess had explained it during the pre-docking briefing, standing in the same spot he currently occupied, with the same expression of calm sufficiency. The rite was the sovereignty's formal process for assigning a species to one of 4 tiers of divine rank, which determined the scope and nature of all future diplomatic engagement. A first-tier species was considered to possess sacred sovereignty. The sovereignty itself fell into this category, as did 2 other civilizations I had never heard of. Second tier was reserved for species the sovereignty considered peer level by virtue of demonstrated spiritual or martial capacity. Third tier was the working rank for most civilizations humanity had encountered, sufficient to be acknowledged, insufficient to be treated as equals. Fourth tier was effectively non-contact. The sovereignty's records, compiled over 3 centuries of survey work, placed roughly 400 known species at third tier. Humanity had been third tier since the first veteran contact 30 years ago. The second contact, 7 years later, had confirmed it. This was the third contact, and it was the first to include a doctrinal survey, a physical inspection, which Sess had explained meant the sovereignty was in the process of re-evaluation. Commander Okafor had briefed us on what that meant in plain terms. They think we might have grown up enough to be second tier, and this is them checking. We're to be professional, cooperative, and unremarkable. Unremarkable. I had been in the fleet for 14 months, 6 of those at the Signals Academy on Meridian Station, 6 in orbit drills, 2 on transit to this posting. I was 23 years old, and I had not yet seen anything I would call remarkable, not in the military sense, though I had seen the Karath Nebula from the forward observation port on my second day aboard the Lance, and I had stood there for 20 minutes without moving, which I don't think counts. The stars were remarkable. The ship was unremarkable by design. The night before the veteran vessel arrived, Commander Okafor had gathered the full crew in the main corridor, all 48 of us, which was tight in that space. A lot of people standing with their backs to the hull or perched on access ladders, and he had spoken for about 4 minutes. Not a long speech. He wasn't given to long speeches. He said, "The veteran sovereignty has a 300-year record of accurate and careful survey work. Their tier system is not an insult. It is their way of understanding a galaxy that is very large and very strange. We are going to be professional and cooperative, and exactly what we appear to be, which is a diplomatic crew doing our jobs." He paused there in the way he paused when a word needed weight, and he said, "All 48 of us. Everything will be fine." He didn't say anything about the formation. He didn't have to. Everyone aboard the Lance knew what was parked outside, had known since we arrived at this position 3 days earlier, and the formation had decloaked briefly for us to confirm visual count, then cloaked again. 43 ships. The formation commander's identifier had appeared on my board for 4 seconds and then disappeared, and I had stared at the space where it had been for longer than was probably professional. Commander Okafor didn't mention the formation and nobody asked about it, which told me something about the kind of crew I was on. The first hour had gone exactly as briefed. The veteran shuttle docked at Bay 2 with a precision that my navigation feed registered as genuinely impressive. They were working with a different geometry, a 3-thruster configuration arranged in a trident pattern at the shuttle's stern, and the pilot had brought it in through the bay's guidance field without using any of our assist signals, which implied either a very good pilot or sensor technology that didn't need our help. I noted it in my log. I noted most things in my log that day. The delegation emerged in the sequence Sess had described. The attendants first, then Orthavith, then Sess himself, wearing a plain gray suit that I recognized as deliberately unceremonial, the clothing of a functionary who wanted to be as invisible as possible in someone else's ritual. The high priest's robes were deep green, close to the color of oxidized copper, with a hem embroidered in white thread, in a pattern that Sess's briefing had described as the rite-specific liturgical marking. It was the first time I had seen veteran ceremonial dress in person rather than in briefing photographs, and in person, it was more textured than the photographs suggested, layers of a material that caught the light differently depending on which direction you were approaching from, so that as the priest walked up the docking corridor, The robe seemed to shift between dark green and something closer to gray-black, almost like engine exhaust in low light. Commander Akafor met them at the corridor's junction with the main deck. He was in dress uniform, which on the lance meant the dark gray jacket with the Tyrant fleet insignia at the collar, no medals, no rank insignia beyond the commander's bar. The briefing had been specific. The Sovereignty Survey Protocol did not recognize Terran rank systems, and any visual markers of hierarchy on our side would be processed by the delegation as unexplained information, which in Vetherin ceremonial law fell into a subcategory of spiritual irregularity. So the commander wore the bar, which was required for legal command authority, and nothing else, and the delegation did not look at it or comment. Sess made the introductions in Vetherin. The high priest responded with a phrase of approximately 8 syllables, and Sess translated it as, "The survey acknowledges the host vessel and its representative." That was all. The standard Terran diplomatic greeting, Commander Akafor had prepared a short phrase in Vetherin, which Sess had drilled him on for 2 days, was not given, because the rites protocol did not include a host greeting until after the first liturgical movement. These things have their sequence, and the sequence matters to people for whom the sequence is sacred. I watched it all on feed 3, and on feed 1, and on the corridor feed, and I watched my board and the 6 hours began. The rite of categorical reckoning involved a great deal of verse. Sess had told us to expect liturgical segments totaling approximately 4 hours, interspersed with intervals of silent inspection during which the high priest and his attendants would walk whatever space they were granted access to and observe. We had been granted access to the forward observation deck, the signal arrays deck, the diplomatic reception bay, the officers' mess, and the main corridor running port side from the bow. Everything aft of frame 30 was restricted, which the pre-survey documentation had listed as standard operating procedure for diplomatic-class vessels hosting survey teams, and which the sovereignty had apparently accepted without question, because the Lance was, after all, a diplomatic frigate with nothing remarkable to hide. The walking intervals had taken them through each accessible section once. The high priest moved slowly, with purpose, pausing at viewports, running one long finger along the signal array housings without touching them, examining the structural joints with what I could only describe as professional interest. There was something methodical in it that I recognized from the briefing. The survey was not casual curiosity. It was documentation, the physical component of the doctrinal council's assessment process. His attendants followed and logged on small devices that Sess had told us were essentially recording instruments, capturing not imagery but what he described as presence readings, a concept I filed in the part of my understanding labeled approximately true. On the forward observation deck, the high priest had stood at the main viewport for nearly 8 minutes. I watched it on the feed, 8 minutes at the viewport looking out at the stars, while Commander Akafor stood at a respectful distance and the 2 attendants logged behind them both. What the priest was reading from the stars, whether he was performing some element of the liturgy or simply looking, I couldn't know. But in those 8 minutes, the 40 Hz carrier signal had shifted register slightly, moving up to perhaps 42 Hz, and I had noted it in the log without being certain it meant anything. After the survey, it was the annotation that diplomatic analysts returned to most often, though they never reached a consensus on its significance. Sess walked beside them and said nothing unless they addressed him. Commander Akafor accompanied the delegation in person during the walking intervals, and I watched him on the feed, steady and easy, hands clasped behind his back, answering the priest's questions through Sess in the same tone he used to discuss maintenance schedules. Once, in the officers' mess, the priest stopped beside the long table and asked through Sess how many crew ate here at a single sitting. Commander Akafor said 48. The priest looked at the table, which seated 16, and looked at the commander, and through Sess asked whether 48 was the full complement or a partial one. Commander Akafor said it was the full crew of the Lance. The priest appeared to note this and moved on. There was a second question in the officer's mess that I logged, but that didn't make the formal record, because Sess flagged it as a translation artifact, a phrase that didn't carry well from Vetherin ecclesiastical to standard. What I heard on my audio feed in Sess's careful translation undertone was something like, and the larger compliment, Commander Akaffer had said, "I'm not sure I follow." Sess had translated a short exchange and then said to the commander, "I believe he's asking about total vessel capacity, perhaps the structural capacity versus the posted crew." Commander Akaffer had said, "The Lance is rated for 96. Sess had translated, "The priest had moved on." I had noted it without knowing why it felt notable. 6 hours later, I thought I understood. None of the crew spoke unless spoken to. No one clustered in corridors. No one stared. The briefing had covered that too. The Vetherin doctrinal survey was partly a behavioral assessment. They were watching how the crew moved around the space, whether there was anxiety, whether there was order. Third-tier species, Sess had explained without editorializing, typically displayed visible discomfort during survey. It was considered expected, even appropriate, a sign that the species understood the weight of what was being evaluated. Comfort and composure, he had noted in the careful tone of a man choosing words very precisely, was considered by the sovereignty to be either a second-tier quality or a sign that the species didn't understand what was happening. Commander Akeffer had heard that and nodded and said nothing. The crew moved like a crew. They did their work. When the delegation walked the signal array's deck and I was at my post, doing what a signals officer does, and the high priest had stopped beside my console for approximately 40 seconds, and I had not looked up from my display, because I had work to do and nothing on my display required me to look up. I felt his attention on the back of my neck the way you feel a temperature difference, not uncomfortable, just present. Then he moved on. That had been 3 hours ago. The verse segments were harder to describe than the inspection intervals, partly because they were longer and partly because I had no framework for evaluating them. Sess had told us the liturgy was recited in full Vetherin ecclesiastical, which was distinct from the conversational dialect he translated, and which he was not qualified to translate in real time because it required specialist doctrinal knowledge he didn't have. What we got was the sound of it, and the sound was strange in ways that I found difficult to describe in the log. It had a regularity, a pulse, that sat at the edge of the 40 Hz band my equipment was trained to monitor, so that when the priest recited and the standing vibration ran together, both in that register, they created something that landed in the body rather than the ear. Not music exactly, not anything I had a word for. The briefing had said the liturgy was not intended to be understood by survey subjects, only witnessed, and I think that was the most honest thing in the briefing, because witnessing without understanding was in fact what I did for those 4 hours, and it left a particular kind of residue that doesn't appear in the log. The high priest recited standing. He didn't use notes, didn't reference any text, didn't pause except for the rhythmic pauses that seemed built into the structure of the verse itself. His voice, when he was reciting, was lower than when he spoke. A different register, a different production, something that seemed to come from the chest rather than the throat, and that the neck ridge appeared to amplify or at least accompany. Because when he was in full liturgical mode, the ridge vibrated faintly at a frequency I could see on my board. I had not expected that. The briefing hadn't mentioned it. I logged it and moved on, and later I went back to that log entry 4 or 5 times, trying to understand what exactly I was describing. The third liturgical movement had lasted 90 minutes. The fourth, currently underway, was supposed to be the shortest. Sess had estimated 40 minutes for the final movement, including the categorical pronouncement. I had been watching the clock. Now he stood on the dais at the far end of the diplomatic reception bay. The ceremony had returned there for the final liturgical movement, and he was looking at his hands, and the verse had stopped. I didn't register it as significant immediately. Verses stopped. People paused. Sess was standing at the edge of the dais and his face had gone very still, which was the first thing that suggested something was actually happening. Then I looked at my board. The standing vibration at 40 hertz had ceased. That was the communication channel I wasn't supposed to try to intercept. It had run without a break since the delegation stepped off the shuttle. Continuous, the way a carrier signal runs when there's something to carry. And now it was gone, and the silence in its place registered on my display as absence the way a held breath registers on a room. I pulled up the secondary feeds. The two attendants were motionless behind the priest, not the motionless of a ceremony's formal posture, the motionless of people who have just received information their bodies don't know how to process yet. Their neck ridges, which had been angled back in what Sess's briefing characterized as the standard relaxed survey posture, were now fully raised. In veteran physiology, the neck ridge elevation was an autonomic stress response. It was not a conscious display. It was the alien equivalent of the hair rising on your arms. I switched to the external feed. I said later that I knew before I looked. I don't think that's quite true. I think I suspected, because the timing was exact, 5 hours, 53 minutes, and I had known the timing since my first day aboard. But suspecting and knowing are different things, and what I saw on the external feed was something I had known about intellectually for 6 weeks and had never once pictured clearly, because some things resist the imagination until they're in front of you. There were 43 of them. 43 warships, each larger than the Tyrant's lance, in a formation that encircled the current position of the lance and the veteran diplomatic vessel at intervals of approximately 6 kilometers. They had materialized out of empty space, decloak events, all of them within a 4-second window, which I knew represented a calibration achievement that most Allied fleets couldn't match in exercises. Their running lights were off. Their engine signatures were minimal, just enough to hold station. They were not targeting anyone. They were not transmitting. They were present. I stared at the external feed for a moment that I did not log, because I was not logging at that exact moment. I was looking. The ships were not identical. They ranged from heavy cruiser class to something larger, a type I didn't have a name for from my academy training, wedge-shaped and massively built, with gun emplacements visible as dark slots along the hull at even intervals. No running lights, as I said. No identifying beacons. Just the shapes of them against the star field, each one cutting a hard geometry into the dark, and the geometry repeated 42 times and they were all still. My console showed 6 other stations were watching the same external feed. That was the entire available shift crew, minus the 2 engine room techs whose consoles didn't have an external display. Someone, I think it was Drevin, on navigation, had tagged the feed with a visual designation label for each ship, pulling from our preloaded formation manifest, so every hull had a small identifier floating at the edge of the image. The labels were clean and orderly, numbers running from F01 through F43, and looking at the feed with 43 small numbered labels attached to 43 dark warship hulls in a perfect enclosing arc, was somehow more striking than any of the individual ships would have been alone. The numbers made it real in a way the shapes hadn't quite done yet. 43. The count was exact. The formation was called a Sovereign's Cradle. I had read the name in the ship's operational briefing on my first day and not thought much about it beyond the name itself. Looking at it now on the feed, 43 ships, the Lance at the center, the veteran vessel nested beside us, I thought the name was exactly right. It was not a threatening shape. It was a containing shape, a held shape. It said, "You are inside something, and the something was here before you knew it." I looked back at the diplomatic feed. The high priest had lowered his hands. He was standing perfectly straight now, which was unusual for a veteran of his age. Sess had mentioned that the neck ridge grew heavier as the species aged, which was why elder priests had the most pronounced forward lean. But Orthaveth III recital was standing straight, and his neck ridge was still raised, and he was looking at the forward viewport of the diplomatic reception bay, which showed, if you knew what to look at, the distant running light traces of the nearest formation ships. The nearer ships, the 6 in the closest ring of the cradle, were visible in the viewport without magnification. Not clearly, not with the detail I had on my external feed, but as shapes, dark against a field of stars that was darker, the hard rectangles of their silhouettes intersecting the star field like something that should not be there because nothing that size should be that quiet. The high priest was looking at those shapes. Commander Akafar was standing 3 meters from the priest, still in his clasped hands posture, and I could see his face on the feed, and his face was the same as it had been during the walking intervals and during the liturgical movements, and during the 4 hours before I came on shift. Whatever he was thinking or feeling, it was not on his face, because he had been doing this for 19 years, and this was not the first time he had stood in this room while the ships came out. It was the first time I had. I will tell you what I felt, because the log should be honest about this even if the after-action report wasn't. I felt something I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't fear, although my hands were not entirely steady. It wasn't pride exactly, though there was something adjacent to it, some recognition of scale that landed differently when it was your scale being recognized. It was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and having no unit of measurement adequate to it. I had grown up reading about the fleet. I had read the numbers. 43 ships in a sovereign's cradle formation had been a number, and now it was a picture, and the distance between those two things was considerable. I kept my voice out of my throat and my hands on my board, and I did my job. On the diplomatic feed, Sess had moved. He stepped up beside the high priest, close enough that their conversation, if they were having one, would be very quiet. I couldn't read Vetherin lip movement, and my audio pickup on that feed wasn't fine enough to catch a whisper at that distance. What I could see was that the priest was not speaking. Sess said something. The priest did not respond. One of the attendants moved for the first time in 4 minutes. He stepped forward half a pace, looked at the same viewport the priest was looking at, and then stepped back. His neck ridge had not come down. If anything, looking at the feed closely, it had elevated further. The second attendant was logging. I could see the small recording device in his hand, the way it had been in his hand throughout the inspection intervals, and he was using it now, not taking general readings of the room but pointed, I thought, at the high priest, documenting the priest's response, recording whatever a presence reading of a Vetherin high priest in a moment of unscripted stillness would capture. The 40 Hz channel remained silent. I tagged the moment in my log 05:53:17 by the contact clock and kept tagging at 30-second intervals after that, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and the discipline of the log was something solid to hold onto. At 05:55:00 the priest turned away from the viewport. He did not turn toward the table or toward Sess. He turned toward the far wall, which was bare hull plate, and he stood looking at it for approximately 90 seconds. His attendant stood behind him. Sess waited. Commander Akafar did not move. The hull plate didn't have anything on it. No viewports, no signage, just the raw gray-green of the Lance's interior composite, slightly scuffed near the floor from years of equipment transit. It was possibly the least remarkable surface on the ship. I have wondered since then what the priest was seeing when he looked at it, or whether he was seeing it at all. Whether he was running a reckoning in his head. One of those private accountings that don't have anything to do with what's in front of you and everything to do with what's been overturned. At 05:56:31 the high priest turned back to the table. He spoke to Sess. It was brief. The word count was perhaps 12 syllables in Vetherin, and Sess's expression moved in a way I had not seen it move in 6 hours. I don't mean he was startled or upset. He was controlled. But something moved in his face, and he turned to Commander Akafar and he said, "The high recital requests a recess of 30 minutes. Commander Akafar said, "Of course." That was all. The delegation was shown to the secondary reception room, the room set aside for exactly this, and Sess went with them. Commander Akafor stood in the diplomatic bay for a moment after the door closed, and then he looked directly at one of my cameras, which I had gotten used to him doing in the 6 weeks I'd worked under him, and he said, "You're doing fine, Salon. Stay on your board." "Yes, Commander." "Log everything you have from the last 8 minutes, time stamped." "Already done, Commander." He looked at the camera for another second, and then he left. I pulled up the external feed again. The 43 ships were still there. They had not moved since the decloak, still holding station at the same intervals, still dark, still quiet. The formation was perfect in the way that things are perfect when they have been planned by people who plan for a long time, who thought about every variable including the variable of being seen, and decided in advance what the shape of being seen should look like. The formation said, in the language of hull mass and engine silence, "We were here. We were here the whole time. We waited." I looked at the formation for longer than I needed to for signal purposes, and then I looked at my board, and I did my job. The recess ran 47 minutes, not 30. I don't know what happened in the secondary reception room. Cess never gave a debrief that I attended, and the formal diplomatic record is classified at a level I've never been granted. What I know is what my feeds showed me. 3 veteran figures sitting at a low table, none of them moving much. The 40 Hz carrier signal resuming at very low amplitude about 12 minutes in and running steadily after that. Cess sat with them for the first 20 minutes and then stood near the door for the remainder. Commander Akafor did not enter the room. What I can tell you is what happened on the Lance's bridge during those 47 minutes, because I had a partial audio feed to the bridge and Commander Akafor was there for most of it. He ran it as a normal working period, not ostentatiously, not with the particular performance of calm that a lesser officer might have deployed, the visible composure that signals its own effort. He sat at the command station and reviewed the signal logs from the prior 6 hours, which I know because my console showed his access times. He asked the navigation officer a routine question about our jump calculation for the outbound leg. He got up once, went to the forward viewport. The bridge had a direct line to the cradle formation, the nearest ships visible without magnification even from the command deck, and stood there for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he went back to his station. I think about that 90 seconds sometimes. What he saw through that viewport was the same thing the High Priest had seen through the diplomatic bay viewport, the dark shapes of the formation, the geometry of a very large capability held very still. But the commander had been here before. He had stood at other viewports in other first contact situations and watched the ships come out, and the familiarity had not, as far as I could tell, made it unremarkable to him. It had made it something else. Something you stand at a viewport to look at rather than something you sit at a console to manage. He went back to his station, and the 47 minutes ran down to nothing. At the 47-minute mark, the door opened and Cess came out first. He walked to the diplomatic bay and stood at his table. Commander Akafor was already there. The two of them exchanged approximately 30 seconds of conversation that I tagged but could not hear clearly on my audio. My pickup wasn't positioned for it, and I had standing orders not to redirect audio equipment toward command staff without authorization. What I got was Cess's expression and posture, which were the most readable they'd been all day. He looked like a man who had been handed something heavier than he'd expected and was concentrating very hard on not dropping it. The delegation returned to the bay. The rite of categorical reckoning resumed. What happened next I will try to describe as accurately as I can, because it is the part that doesn't reduce well to a log entry. The High Priest resumed his place on the dais. He stood for a moment, and his neck ridge was still elevated, lower than it had been at the decloak moment, but not at resting position. He began the next movement of the rite. Cess translated simultaneously in the low undertone he'd been using all day, and I had audio on the translation feed clearly enough to hear it. The rite of categorical reckoning in its final movement involved a formal declaration, What Sess had described in the briefing as the categorical pronouncement, the High Priest's official statement of tier assignment. I had understood it to be largely ceremonial at this point, a formality confirming what two previous contacts had already established. Third tier, suitable for continued limited diplomatic engagement, nothing to be alarmed by. What the High Priest said in the final movement of the rite was not the standard categorical pronouncement. Sess translated it in real time, and I logged every word, and the log reads as follows. The survey notes that the vessel Tyrant's lance represents one component of a larger formation, the full extent of which the survey has now observed. The survey further notes that this formation was present and concealed throughout the period of the rite without disclosure to the survey team. The survey records this as consistent with neither third-tier nor fourth-tier behavioral patterns as defined in the sovereignty's canonical taxonomy. The survey will transmit its findings to the Doctrinal Council for formal review. This right of categorical reckoning is suspended pending that review. No tier assignment will be recorded at this time. There was a silence after Sess finished. Commander Akafor said, "We understand and we appreciate the sovereignty's diligence." That was all he said. The silence held for another moment. Then Orthavith III recital turned and his attendants turned with him, and they walked toward the docking corridor without further ceremony. Sess followed. There were no handshakes, veteran protocol didn't include them, no formal farewell phrases, no paperwork exchanged. The delegation passed through the diplomatic bay doors and the contact clock read 6 hours, 4 minutes. I sat at my board. I thought, is that it? I thought, yes, that is it. I pulled up the external feed one more time. The 43 ships were still there. They would stay there until the veteran vessel undocked and cleared the exclusion boundary, which Commander Akafor had communicated to the formation commander via a short, encrypted burst the moment the recess was called. The ships held. They did not posture. They did not light up their gun arrays or run targeting sweeps. They held the way they had been holding since before the veteran shuttle ever entered our bay, because that was what they had been told to do, and the people who had been told to do it had done it without complaint or incident, for 6 hours and 4 minutes in the dark. 22 minutes later the veteran diplomatic vessel undocked. It moved at standard transit speed to the established exclusion boundary, which it crossed at the far edge of my sensor range, and then it jumped. The flash was a bright brief point on my secondary display, and then it was gone. I noted the departure time in the log. The 43 ships of the Sovereign's cradle formation had already been gone for 16 minutes. They didn't jump one by one. They went in a coordinated sequence, groups of 6 and 7, timed so that the last ship jumped inside 12 seconds of the first. I had watched it on the external feed, the formation lights winking out in clusters, the space around the lance becoming what it had looked like when we arrived here 3 days ago, just space, unremarkable, a patch of stars and the distant smudge of the callous dust band at the margin of my sensor range. The release order had come from Commander Akafor the moment the veteran shuttle cleared our bay. I had watched the encrypted burst go out on my board, 3 characters, a standard formation release code, and within 60 seconds the first group of 6 ships had jumped. Then the next, then the next. From the outside, on the external feed, it had looked effortless. A formation that had held perfect station for 6 hours dissolving in 12 seconds, each ship jumping on its calculated vector, the space it had occupied becoming empty space again, as though the ship had never been there at all. That was, I thought, exactly the point. They had been there and they had not been there. They had been present the whole time, invisible, known only to the crew of the Lance and to the formation commander's encrypted channel, and they had not moved, not communicated, not announced themselves. And then when the ceremony was over they had gone home. The veteran delegation would have seen the decloak on their own sensors. They would have confirmed the count, 43. They would have held that number all the way back to sovereignty space, and they would have given it to the doctrinal council, and the council would have sat with it. 43 ships, present the whole time, silent, still, gone in 12 seconds when they were no longer needed. I filed my shift log, tagged and annotated, and I sat with it on my screen for a moment before I sent it up the chain. I had written 4,200 words of log in 6 hours, which was more than I had written in the previous 6 weeks combined. Most of it was routine, sensor readings, transmission times, the pedestrian notation of a ceremony proceeding without incident. But the last 8 minutes before the recess, and the final movement of the rite, were annotated very carefully, because I had understood, somewhere in the middle of writing them, that I was recording something that would be read by people I would never meet, in contexts I couldn't predict, and that the accuracy of what I had observed mattered in ways I couldn't fully account for. The young do this. They take careful notes when they sense that history is moving and they are close enough to feel it. I don't mean that in any grand sense. I mean that I was 23 and it was my first posting, and something had happened in that room that I wanted to have right. Commander Okafor came back through the diplomatic bay at the end of my shift. He stopped at my console, the way he sometimes did, and looked at my display for a moment without asking me to explain it. He said, "Good shift, Salon." I said, "Thank you, Commander. Can I ask, did we know that they'd react the way they did?" He thought about that for a moment. He had a way of pausing before he answered that I had come to understand was not evasiveness, but care. The pause of a man who wanted the word he chose to be the right one. He said, "We knew they'd see something." Was it the right call? Another pause. That's a question for the diplomatic record. I looked at my hands, which were still, and at my board, which was clean, and I thought about the high priest looking at his own hands mid-verse, and I said, "I don't think he expected it." Commander Okafor said, "No, I don't think he did." He left. I filed the log and went to eat something. That was the third veteran contact. There was not a fourth. I mean that precisely. As of the time I am writing this, 11 years after that shift, from a posting I could not have imagined then, the veteran sovereignty has not initiated a fourth formal contact with Terran diplomatic services. They have not responded to 2 subsequent Terran outreach transmissions. They have not been silent in the broader galactic sense. They continue to conduct surveys of other species, to issue tier assessments, to maintain their diplomatic circuits with first and second tier civilizations. Their trade routes still pass through sectors adjacent to Terran-claimed space. Their ships are occasionally observed at the edge of Terran sensor range, present for a few hours, then gone. But they have not transmitted. 11 years. I have thought about this more than is probably useful. In the early years after the Lance posting, when I was still trying to make sense of what I had seen and what it meant, I asked everyone I could ask, senior officers, diplomatic analysts, a veteran cultural consultant I met briefly at a conference on Herath Station, what they thought the silence meant. The answers I got were thoughtful and varied, and all of them were, at bottom, speculation. The sovereignty's internal records are not accessible to Terran intelligence. Their doctrinal council has not issued any public statement about the suspended rite. Sess retired from his intermediary role 4 years after the contact and did not give interviews. The attendants' names were never publicly recorded. The most common interpretation among diplomatic analysts is that the sovereignty is in a classification impasse. Their taxonomy, built over 3 centuries, has a fixed number of tiers, and the Lance contact created a data point that doesn't fit cleanly into any of them. Third tier is ruled out by the behavioral and capability evidence. Second tier requires a formal rite completion. First tier is the sovereignty's own category, and as far as anyone knows, has never been assigned to an outside species. The doctrinal council may be in the process of theological revision, of rethinking the framework itself, and may simply not be ready to speak until that revision is complete. That's the analysis I find most plausible. But I want to be honest, it is still speculation. What I know, what I can attest to from my own log, is what happened in that room and what I observed on those feeds, and none of that tells me what Orthavith III recital decided in the 47-minute recess, or what he reported to the doctrinal council when he returned to Vetherin space, or what the priests sitting in that council chamber said to one another when they read his survey notes. I think about his hands sometimes. The verse stopped and he looked at his hands, and I don't know if that was a theological gesture, something in the liturgy I had missed, or if it was something purely personal, an involuntary movement, the alien equivalent of a man who has just been told something he didn't expect, pressing his palms to the table to feel something solid. I'm not sure it matters which. Both of those things can be true at once. What I know is this. The 43 ships came out in 4 seconds. The priest's neck ridge elevated. The 40 Hertz channel went quiet. And in the middle of a ceremony designed to tell us what we were, in front of a man whose professional life had been built on the certainty that the taxonomy was complete, something refused to be categorized. I know the Lance was a diplomatic frigate. I know it was 48 crew and 3 signal arrays, and a point defense complement you could describe as modest without technically lying. I know it had nothing remarkable to hide, as a ship. I know the Sovereign's cradle had 43 ships in it, and that they had been there since before the Vetherin vessel docked, and that the formation held for the full length of the ceremony without a single transmission, without a hull light out of position, without a detectable signature beyond the very narrow band I was not authorized to probe. The Vetherin Sovereignty classified their first formal contact with the Tyrant fleet as incomplete. They have been revising their taxonomy ever since. I find, when I think about it now, not with the young nervousness of a 23-year-old at her console, but with the particular flatness of someone who has spent 11 years watching how that silence propagates through every diplomatic channel that touches Vetherin space. I find that I understand why Orthavith III recital went quiet when the ships came out. It was not fear, exactly, or not only fear. There was something else in it, something the neck ridge elevation doesn't capture, and that the 40 Hertz silence doesn't capture. What I think he felt, and I want to be clear that this is my reading, based on nothing more than watching his face on a secondary diplomatic camera for 6 hours, was the specific disorientation of a man who has spent a lifetime measuring things, suddenly finding himself in the presence of a thing that exceeds his instrument. The instrument was the taxonomy, 3 centuries old, 4 tiers, 400 species surveyed and assigned. The Sovereignty's doctrinal council had built the taxonomy through long, careful work, through exactly the kind of rigorous field observation that brought Orthavith and his attendants to our diplomatic bay, and it had been adequate to everything they'd encountered until the moment it wasn't. The taxonomy was the instrument, and the instrument had a range, and outside the range, it simply returned no reading. A human signals officer would say the instrument was out of spec. A Vetherin high priest, I imagine, would have a different formulation for the same experience. You can fear that. You can also be in some part of yourself, despite everything it costs you and the certainty you had walked in with, something close to awed. I was awed. I will say it plainly, which the after-action report did not. I was 23 years old and it was my first posting and the ships came out in 4 seconds, and I was awed. I think maybe we all were, even the ones who had seen it before, even Commander Akaffer with his 19 years. Even the ships themselves, if ships can be said to hold anything. There is something in the fact of that formation, the patience of it, the held breath of it, 43 ships in silence for hours, that asks something of you when you think about it directly. It asks you to take seriously the idea of a thing that is enormously capable and also enormously still, that can wait without announcing that it is waiting, that was already there long before the ceremony began. The ceremony was supposed to tell us what we were. What it told us in the end is that we were the ones who had already arrived. 6 years after the Lance posting, I was assigned to the diplomatic analysis section at Meridian Command, and one of my first tasks was to compile a summary of the Vetherin contact record, all three of them, from the original 30-year-old approach through the current silence. It was a routine task, the kind of background document analysts produce constantly for briefing packages, and I did it thoroughly and without distinguishing it from any other file I worked on that week. Except that when I got to the third contact, to my own log, I found myself slowing down. I read the log entries the way you read things you wrote very long ago, looking for the person who wrote them, finding them in the gaps between the data. There I was at 05, 53, 17, tagging the moment the verse stopped. There I was at 30-second intervals, holding onto the discipline of the log. There was the note I had added at the end of the shift that I almost cut from the official version before I sent it up. The Sovereignty's vessel departed without incident. No tier assignment recorded. External formation secured and released to standard dispersal. All contacts nominal. Something has changed. I am not sure yet what to call it. I left that note in. I don't know why. It wasn't analysis. It wasn't intelligence. It was just the true thing I had written at the end of a true shift, and I left it because removing it felt like a different kind of error. The document I compiled went into the Vetherin contact dossier at Meridian, and I imagine it is still there. Whether anyone has read it recently, I don't know. Whether the Doctrinal Council will ever resolve its impasse and transmit a new tier assessment, I don't know. Whether Orthavith III recital is still alive. Vetherin lifespans are poorly documented in available xenobiological records. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that the fourth contact has not come, and that in 11 years of watching that particular channel, I have noticed that the silence itself has a quality that ordinary absence doesn't have. Ordinary absence is a closed channel. This is something else, a channel that was opened and then not closed, that sits at the edge of the diplomatic bandwidth, not transmitting but not static either. Not dead air, held air. The way a room stays changed after a conversation that mattered. I have done this long enough to know that most silences from sovereign powers eventually resolve into something legible, a communique, a withdrawal, a renewed contact, a hostile action that at least clarifies intent. The Vetherin silence has not resolved, and I have stopped expecting it to on any timeline I can compute. The Doctrinal Council does not work on human timescales. Their 3-century survey record suggests a body that thinks in generations, and if they are in the process of revising a taxonomy they have relied on for 3 centuries, then 11 years may be, to them, a reasonable period of early deliberation. I have also noticed, and I include this because the intelligence record should include it, though I expect the people who read this will have already noticed, that the Vetherin silence has been observed by other species. The sovereignty survey patterns are well documented and widely tracked. When a civilization that has issued formal tier assessments after every contact in 3 centuries stops issuing them for a specific species, other civilizations notice. I have been in rooms at Herath Station, at the 3rd Multilateral Contact Summit at Vetherin-adjacent border zone Delta, in 2 separate bilateral briefings with species I am not authorized to name in this account, where the silence itself became a topic of discussion. What does it mean, they asked, that the sovereignty is quiet? What did the survey find that it hasn't told anyone? I did not answer those questions in those rooms. It wasn't my place, but I think about them. We are patient people. We have learned to be. We will be here when they are ready, and we will be here if they never are. Either way, the formation was true, and they saw it, and that is something neither the silence nor the waiting changes. I will say one more thing and then close this account, because it has no ending in the narrative sense and probably never will, and I have learned not to want one. On the day the Vetherin vessel jumped out of sensor range, the day of the 3rd contact, the evening of my first long shift, I was sitting in the officers' mess eating a bowl of something I cannot now remember, and one of the other signals officers, a man named Drevin who had been on the Lance for 3 years and had been through the previous 2 veteran contacts in earlier postings, sat down across from me and said nothing for about a minute and then said, "First time." I said yes. He said, "It's always different seeing it." I said, "The formation." He said, "All of it, the whole thing, the way they came in expecting one thing and left not knowing what to do with what they found." He pushed food around his bowl. "First time I saw a sovereign's cradle come out, I thought it was a tactical alert. Second time I understood what I was looking at. Third time I just watched." I said, "What did you think this time?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought they're going to need a new word." I ate my food. I thought about that for the rest of the evening, and then I thought about it on and off for the next 11 years, and I think he was right. The sovereignty has been silent because they have been working on the word. They built a taxonomy over 3 centuries, and they are proud people and careful people, and they will not issue a new category until they are certain it is right. When they find it, I expect they will transmit. And when they transmit, we will be here, and we will answer, and that will be the 4th contact. But I am not waiting for it. I am working, and the channel stays open, and the callous dust band is still visible at the margin of my sensor range on clear days, which here means something different than it does on a planet, because in space clear and unclear are both just kinds of dark, and what changes is not the light but what you're willing to look at. I am willing to look at all of it now. That is what the Lance gave me. 6 hours and 43 ships and a high priest who stopped reciting verse and looked at his hands, and the long quiet afterward, and the understanding that some things wait to be named, that the waiting is not absence but a kind of attention, and that the best thing you can do in the middle of it is stay at your board and do your job and keep the log honest. The contact clock had read 5 hours, 51 minutes when he paused and looked at his hands. The channel has been open ever since. We did not close it. They did not close it. Somewhere in veteran space, a body of priests is still working on a word, and in Terran space we are still at our boards, and in between us there is a region of diplomatic bandwidth that holds the silence of something that has not yet been named, but has not been forgotten either. That is enough. For now it is enough.